So good evening and welcome to our keynote event for our 2021 Community Read Program. My name is Kathy Cohane. I'm the proud chair of the Belmont Public Library Trustees. It is my honor tonight to introduce our keynote speaker, Dolores Johnson. Before I turn the podium over to Ms. Johnson, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about our path to the program tonight and recognize all that have contributed. I think, as folks know, we typically host One Book, One Belmont program every other March. But this year, our community partners and library staff in planning for this year's program recognized and embraced the need to do something different, something that touched on the topics that we're all facing, the challenges, and really be a resource for the community. It is the role of the public library to serve and be a resource for our community. And we feel with this year's program, we are working towards that goal and mission. The program is being referred to as Better Through Books, Healing Community Together. And that's exactly what the planning committee has designed and has been delivering. 2 months of programming with a focus on diversity, equality, and healing, focusing on inclusion, bringing a variety of programs forward for our community to participate, engage, discuss, and enjoy, and to learn, most importantly. I want to thank the Planning Committee for their innovation, energy, and commitment to truly bringing a unique program forward. This would not have been possible without the generous support from the Friends of the Belmont Public Library, who have sponsored tonight's program and all the others over this journey. A heartfelt thanks to the community groups that have partnered with us to bring this to fruition. Those groups include Belmont Against Racism, Belmont Books, Belmont Chinese American Society, the Belmont Council on Aging, Belmont Food Collaborative, Friends of the Belmont Public Library, the Belmont Gallery of Art, the Human Rights Commission, Belmont Public Schools, Belmont Religious Council, the Belmont Wellness Coalition, the Belmont Women's Club, the Board of Library Trustees, and library staff. Truly a community effort. So with that, let me turn it over to our main event for this evening and introduce to you Dolores Johnson, who's the author of Say I'm Dead, a Family Memoir of Race, Secrets, and Love. Her story of generations of her family who endured fear, secrets, and separation because they refused to be bound by forbidding race-mixing norms and laws. In following their courageous journeys, we travel through America's racial history, from plantation rapes through Jim Crow laws to today's growing acceptance of race mixing. Say I'm Dead won the 2020 Outstanding Literary Award from the National Association of Black Journalists, received a starred review from the American Library Association, and was reviewed in the New York Post and elsewhere. It's now in its second printing, and we hope soon to be third. She's also published essays on race and identity and narratively, the Buffalo News, Writers of Color, Anthology, and elsewhere. Dolores is now at work on a second book. In her previous 30-year career, Johnson was a vice president of international marketing at Fortune 100 tech companies AT&T, Digital Equipment, and Lotus, creating and launching tech solutions for national communications companies in 16 countries. She has also consulted on diversity with colleges, corporations, and nonprofits during her business career. A graduate of Howard University and Harvard Business School, Johnson's last organizational position was project director of digitization of JFK's archives at the Presidential Library and the Library of Congress. With that, I am proudly honored to turn the podium over to Dolores Johnson and appreciate her willingness to be with us and share her story and history with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy, for that generous introduction. And thank you to the entire Belmont community and all of the organizations that are backing the wonderful programming that you've had these last 2 months. I appreciate being here. I'd like to start off with a reading from Say I'm Dead that is the time that my parents talked to my brother David and I for the first time in our 30s about how they met, and they revealed the secret we never knew. Next slide, please. These are my parents, my African-American father, Charles, and my white mother, Ella. The Negro cabbie asked Ella twice if she was sure of the address, if she wanted the colored side of town. She assured him she did, and when the cab pulled up at his place, Charles was waiting outside on the sidewalk. As he helped her out, the cabbie turned all the way around to glare at Charles. "Man, why you want to mix me up in something like this?" "Just take the dollar," Charles said. "You haven't seen a thing, understand?" She went into his room in the boarding house and sat in the nicked easy chair as Charles fixed the Coke she asked for, adding a splash of whiskey and pouring a straight one for himself. She raised her glass and made a toast the boys at her thespian society had taught her. "Here's to it and to it again. If you don't do it when you get to it, you'll never get to it to do it again." He liked the life in her eyes and the spirit in her soul. Without it, he realized, she would have never come over here. Charles turned on the radio to a Moody Blues tune, then a colored announcer came on. "Hey, all you cats out there, it's Saturday night. Get your best girl and cut a rug with us, or the party keeps a-going all night long." He pulled her up to dance, though she protested that she wasn't much good. Ella Fitzgerald was on, a tasket, and while they tried, neither could follow what the other was doing. She knew the foxtrot with its set patterns, but he only knew the country mule. They laughed through false turns and stepping on each other's toes. But when a slow tune came on, they did better. Charles folded her into his chest, and she followed his simple steps. In no time, they were cooking dinner together at his place a couple of nights a week. But as they grew into love, Charles began to worry. He didn't think she understood the trouble she could get in for being with him. Did this white girl even know she could be attacked in the street for it? Did she have any idea of what she could face for breaking the unwritten Jim Crow code? Some of the Indianapolis and Marion County officials were open members of the Klan. They posed as the good guys, doing community service like giving away free wheelchairs and food to white people. But did Ella understand that the Grand Wizard, a man named Stevenson, used to run the nationwide Ku Klux from Indianapolis? That they hated Negroes so much that they terrorized them and killed them? She didn't. Next slide, please. 2 Negro men got lynched in Marion, Indiana, a few years before he and Ella took up. After a robbery and murder, a white woman claimed rape. The suspected men were locked up briefly until a white mob broke into the jail with sledgehammers and strung them up. Charles saw the picture postcard of the lynching taped up next to the price list at the black barbershop. On it, a big crowd of men and women milled around the brown bodies hanging from trees, their white faces satisfied. Take a good look now at the faces of the crowd. The victims' heads bent over their nooses where their necks had broken, their limp legs dangling free, their bodies left on display as whites congratulated themselves on delivering vigilante justice. That was the proof, the man in the next barber's chair told Charles, of how the Klan was the law in Indianapolis. "Don't take no chances in these parts," he said. "Nobody has been called to account." As happened at many lynchings, studio photographers shot a ghastly picture, then sold thousands of copies, like circus souvenirs, to white people who wanted a keepsake. You can go back to the parents' pictures, please. Charles and Ella sat down and he explained to her how it was. Somebody could get the law on him because of their relationship, trump up the charges, throw him in jail, beat him half to death, or lynch him for just touching a white woman. And nobody would do a thing about it. He was getting pretty scared, and she should be too. Ella had to understand that for her part, the place where they both worked would fire her if they found out. It would be a scandal, and all white people would turn their backs on her. My brother David wiped his brow with the handkerchief he always carried and asked incredulously, "Mama, you didn't know any of that? How could you not know?" My life had only been in a white community up to then, Mama said. I was completely sheltered from that kind of thing. Negro business wasn't my business or anyone's that I knew. My family didn't follow politics or race, and even if they had, a lynching wasn't anything to talk about to a young lady. When your father explained all of this to me, I had only the slightest idea. Charles wanted Ella to think these risks through before they saw each other again. She had to decide if the risks were worth it. Could she live with her family never knowing about them? To staying alert all the time so they never made that one mistake that would ruin their lives? He took Ella by the shoulders and finally said he loved her, that he loved her so much he was willing to face those dangers. Charles's forehead sweat and his voice dropped deep with desperation when he said he had to know that Ella loved him the same way. He pulled her close and stroked her thick curls. Take some time and think hard about this. I mean it. And if you don't come back, I'll understand. You can skip ahead to the slide after the lynching. She did come back, and my parents married in Buffalo, New York, where it was legal. On the left, you see my mom and dad, and his mom, my grandmother, who helped raise me. Take a look at her because we'll be talking about her later in the presentation. On the right are my two brothers and me in the middle. The brother on the left grew up to pass for white, married a white girl, lived across town, his children were blonde. The brother on the right became radicalized during the Vietnam War when he was drafted and came back believing that the government had used Black kids as cannon fodder. And so he became a militant, always dressed in a dashiki, had an afro the size of a pumpkin. Later on became the Juneteenth festival captain for the city of Buffalo. But when my parents married and went to Buffalo, where his mom was living, and other members of the family, they were shunned in large part. It was 1943 when intermarriage was unthinkable. The Black family, very few took to her because they said that they were afraid the law was going to show up. This was a runaway white girl with a Black man, and there were going to be guns and lots of trouble, and they didn't want to be in the middle of it. And white people, of course, thought it was an abomination that she had married my dad. And so for a long time, she had no friends, years. But she wanted my oldest brother to go to Catholic school as she had. And so when she took him to enroll in first grade, she met another white woman with a little brown child in the same class. Next slide. The lady on the left was that woman. Her name is Marie. And she and my mom talked in the hall, and she invited her for coffee, where she met a number of the ladies that you see in this picture. This was called the Click Club. Most of these people had to do with a nightclub show that was put on at a prominent club in Buffalo, where people came from Canada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and all around Western New York to hear. They were in interracial marriages with Black jazzmen. And for instance, the lady second on the left became the costume designer for the show. One of the dancers in the review was Rick James' mother. He grew up in Buffalo. His birthday's one day different from mine. There were people, the lady in the middle ran the boarding house where visiting musicians could stay because they couldn't go to the hotels. Count Basie stayed there and jammed with the band. And so this became our cocoon, where people gave us a lot of trouble for just being. We could go to the Click Club for summer picnics and Christmas parties and birthdays and find a normalized life. And this is the group that were my aunties, and their kids were my cousins. They shielded us from the race problems that came to us. For instance, we went on a picnic out in the county park. My oldest brother got into a wasp's nest out on a hike and came screaming back to the shed where we were. And my mom was trying to calm him down. He's rolling on the ground and screaming, and she's trying to pull the stingers out. And a white woman walks past. She's going to the facilities and graciously comes over and offers to help. She makes mud pies, putting dirt in a little water puddle. And soon, after she's packed them around those stingers, she's able to pull them out like a toothpick out of a fresh baked cake. And my brother calms down. Everything is okay. And he stands up, and my dad comes out of the shed and puts his arm around my brother. And the woman looks at my mother and then at my father. Her hand flies up over her mouth, and she ran away as if she had been in the middle of a wasp's nest. In amusement parks, people shoved their children away from us so they wouldn't touch. They spit at us. They called us all kinds of names. It was this cocoon that saved us. There was another incident. I don't want to say that it was only the white people that were upset about us being, because there was a convention for a Black religious group coming to Buffalo, a national convention. And of course, they could not stay in any hotels. So the word was out that in the Black community, if you would provide room and board for these vacationers, you would get $25 a week. And my mom thought, well, that's going to pay for this Catholic school tuition for my oldest brother. And so she signed up. And she was scrubbing corners with a toothbrush and getting out the best linens and cooking food that we didn't usually get for these visitors. And the day they arrived, my father brought them into the living room and called my mother from the kitchen. And the Black woman looked at my mother and she said, well, who is this? And he says, this is my wife. This is Ella. And the woman started to shake her head. She said, somebody should have told us about this. I'm not spending my vacation here with this N-word and his white trash. No. And they get up and they march out. And that's what life was like for us as mixed race people. The Pew Research Center did a study in 1958. So I was already, my parents had been married 15 years and I was 10 by then. This study showed that 96% of Americans were against race mixing. Next slide, please. I want to tell you a bit about my life and living while Black. When I was born, my birth certificate was automatically labeled Negro, nullifying my mother's heritage in my identification. Because we had the one-drop rule in America, where social understanding was that if a person had one drop of Black blood, they were Black. This was white supremacy at its most florid, where every angle possible was used to try and keep a monolithic white purity. We were called mongrels, abominations, sins against nature and God in those days. And that birth certificate and that social understanding set my path as a Black person. It was a time when there was no permission to be half white. I went on to high school where I was tracked in the honors group and taking AP classes and all honors classes. The only other Black kid was the Black dentist's daughter. All the other Black kids that I had gone to elementary school with were put in vocational studies, secretarial, carpentry, and the like. I'm not sure they ever got a fair chance to be in any other learning environment. It seemed like they were automatically put there because we were bused out to this wealthy neighborhood that was, the school was dominated by wealthy families, many of them Jewish and very high achieving families. When my AP classmates were all in a frenzy about where they were going to go to college, I wanted to know what that was about because I never knew anyone who went to college. I think about all these kids we have here in Massachusetts who should go to college, but don't know how, don't have the opportunity, don't have the money. That was me. That was me. I went to see the guidance counselor and I was so ignorant of what college offered or what it was for even. I simply asked, I want to know about going to college. She raised her eyebrow and she said to me, oh no, Dolores, colored girls don't go to college. She never looked at my transcript with all of my straight A's. Instead, she told me, well, if you want to do something after high school, you should take up sewing. On that perfect transcript, there was one D in sewing. I knew she wasn't right. I knew she wasn't right. And so I tried to listen into what other people were doing and figure out how I could get to college. And what happened was I was hanging up sheets in the backyard on Saturday, and the lady next door who worked at the Urban League, the Black lady, said to me, are you going to take the scholarship exam for Howard University? And I didn't know anything about it. My mom said, she'll take it. I won a full 4-year presidential scholarship to Howard, which was one of the most amazing things that had ever happened to me in my life. Because when I arrived there, I was shocked to find out that the president of the university was Black, that the faculty were all people of color, that the bursar was a Black person, that the dean of the law school was Thurgood Marshall. And when we went to the freshman orientation, the president told us, you have been admitted here, not only for you to become educated, but for you to raise the race. That message was imprinted on my entire 4-year term at Howard University. If you were a social work student, an education student, a fine arts student, an economics and business major, you learned about what was needed for the Black community and how you could address it as an educated person. And so that is the mission and the path I have been on my whole life. And everybody who goes to Howard and most of the historically Black colleges feel exactly the same way. From Howard, I went to Harvard Business School, which was the polar opposite of that. There was no nurturing. There was no concern about our success. There was certainly never a mention of anything about Black people or Black community. In 600 cases that I read there was not one Black protagonist. The only Black person I saw was the lady in the cafeteria line serving the food. From there, I became a business person in high tech. And my husband and I both found these jobs that were a great step up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So we decided that we would go, despite my father telling us we had no business going to the Deep South. It was the mid-70s. And we told him he was out of step because in the 60s, 10 years before, they'd passed all the civil rights laws. We could go anywhere we wanted to, buy any place we wanted to. And he just remembered the old days, the 1930s, when he and his mother escaped, as they called it, from Georgia and went to Buffalo. Well, we went to Baton Rouge despite his warning. And after being refused a house that we wanted to buy by a builder, we got a realtor who arranged a sale for us in a different place. A few days after we moved in and our new furniture arrived, there was a banging on the front door one night. And when my husband went there, he found a cross burning on the lawn. We were terrified. We looked out into the darkness up and down the street, and we couldn't see anybody or anything moving. So I called 911, and when the police came, there were lots of squad cars and flashing lights. And the leader, whoever he was, he never told us his name, gave us his card, told us where we could call and if there was any trouble. Came in and he questioned us. Where were we from and what were we doing there? And how long had we been in that house? He fanned his men out through the neighborhood. And when they came back, he came in the house and said to us, well, you must be good niggers because nobody wants to make a complaint against you. I looked at my husband and he just very slightly nodded his head left. Don't say a word is what he meant. And with that, the police left. They never followed up. They never did another thing. So when I see the police beating Rodney King, when I see the fire hoses on the Black people throughout civil rights, and when I see the policeman with his knee on George Floyd's neck, I know exactly what that is. I know exactly how it is when the police don't care about you as a Black person. They do nothing to extend the courtesies of civil protections, and they don't care what happens to you. We were able to escape from Louisiana to New Jersey, where we got even better jobs and began to climb the corporate ladder. This was another amazing experience in that with our advanced degrees, we showed up at our jobs ready to conquer the world, where we found that people didn't want to listen to us, left us off of the invitations to the meetings, ignored what we said, and that we had to learn to, quote, fight the power at work. My husband and I had a second job to learn how to find out the hidden agendas, to meet the naysayers one-on-one, to get them on board, to learn how to code switch, to filter our language and hesitate before we spoke, to change our wardrobe and learn all kinds of analogies that taught us language that would help to control an environment until people would listen to us. That second job of being the first and the only minority in an all-white professional environment is a tiresome thing. You are exhausted from doing your best job and the overlay job of trying to get respect. Please turn to the next slide. I went down south to meet my great Aunt Willie because I thought, I am tilted so far into this corporate dynamic, I'm losing my center. I decided to do my father's genealogy, do the roots thing, It was all the craze at that time and still is. I think there's something like 40 million people on Ancestry and 23andMe and so on today. So I went down to meet this ancient old Aunt Willie in Birmingham, Alabama, because I had had a lot of information from my family in Buffalo, and they thought that she could fill in the blanks from some people that they didn't have the details on. And when I went down there, she got an old dress box out from under the bed and began to show me pictures of people. And over a long weekend, we laid them out on her lace-covered dining room table into generations, who married who, what the dates were. She even knew about the African that was the root of our family, who arrived in Virginia around the 1830s. And she pulled out a picture of my grandmother, who I showed you earlier. And she said, "Aren't you two the spitting image of each other? You know, you both got that white side." And I said to her, "What's white side?" Well, I knew I was half white, but not my grandmother. She said, "You didn't know that your great grandfather was white?" I said, "No, I never heard of this." And then she showed me this lady's picture. This is my great grandmother, Frances, who was a sharecropper on the same land where our ancestors had been slaves in Smithville, Georgia. And as great Aunt Willie explained to me, Frances was ripe, 14 or 15 years old, when the white man on the plantation began to rape her. And eventually the baby she had was my grandmother. When I went home, I asked my grandmother, "Why didn't you ever tell about this?" She said, "There wasn't anything to tell. That man may have made me, but he was not my father." She said he would come around to our house every once in a blue moon with a little bag of candy and sit me on his lap. But I knew once he crossed off that porch, I was never to acknowledge him, and he certainly wasn't going to acknowledge me. The other thing I learned by going to visit Aunt Willie was that after I had typed up this enormous genealogy chart with all of these generations and all of these people on it, for the first time in my life, in my 30s, I saw that the only white person on my family tree was my mother. And I knew that wasn't right. She had to be from someone, somewhere. So I went back to Buffalo, and at a family dinner, I announced that there was something major missing off of our family tree and the genealogy chart. And they all looked at me like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Mama's white family is missing." And my mother made a sound like wind being forced through the crack of a door. My father snapped his suspenders, said, "Expletive deleted." And I kept talking. "Mama, where are our white people?" All of a sudden, I realized that half of me is missing, and I don't know anything about that. I've always been a Black person, but there's another whole page of this genealogy chart that I know nothing about, and I want to go and find out about these people. And that was the first time that she told my brother and I that she had run away with my father to get married because they were afraid to stay where they were. My brother, who was a Black militant, had come back from the war and become, quite the community booster in the Black community. He accused me of being a race traitor. "What do you want with some white people? Aren't you satisfied with the family that you have here? You've always been a Black person. What do you need to do this for? Anyway, why would you want to go to Indiana, where I found out that they were? Why would you want to go out there and try to meet them when you know that when they open the door and find out there's a Black person on the porch claiming to be a relative, They're going to run you off. You are the biggest fool on 2 feet. My mother was crying through the whole thing. Listen, I want nothing to do with this. It had been 36 years since she had ever been in touch with her family or knew anything about them or they about her. And so we made a deal that I, for my own reasons, would go to Indianapolis and try to find the white family, and that I would keep the promise she exacted from me that if I found them, I was to say she was dead. That is the title of the book, Say I'm Dead. Next slide. I did find them, and my mother on the left and her sister on the right were reunited after those 36 years. It was at that time that we learned that after she disappeared, there was a search for her all the way from Indiana to Massachusetts. She had stopped in New York City when she ran away and sent a postcard, and so they concentrated there, but they also called in the FBI, who searched the entire route. And when her case was closed, my mother's family was told she had either been murdered or she was the victim of foul play and probably was sold into white slavery. And that's what they had lived with for 36 years. But we were able to reunite, and our families came together. We had 25 years together as a fully integrated family, where we went to the Indianapolis 500 race. We took vacations. The two of them came to visit me in France when I worked over there, and we went to Paris and we went to Rome. They were staunch Catholics. They wanted to go to Notre Dame to Mass, and we had a wonderful time as an integrated family up until the time they both died in the aughts. I want to read one more passage to you, which is after we were all reunited, I began to search into the white side of my family to try to build out that genealogy chart. And I want to tell you what I found, and I want to tell you what it means. As I read this passage, I want you to consider what the white side of my family was doing. At the same time, what was my Black family doing? And I point this out to you because when we talk about social, racial, and economic disparities, the root of it is right here. I'd only found 2 generations back on my white side with bloodlines in Britain. I found that my discovered whiteness was so much more privileged and freer than I or my Black family began with. My maternal grandmother was raised by a striving craftsman who chose to immigrate to America for a better life, plying his trade freely in the late 1800s, while my Black great-grandmother was a sharecropper being repeatedly raped on a plantation. My maternal grandfather was a self-made electrician hired to help wire up the Indianapolis Motor Speedway as electricity came into its own. And his grandfather was a banker born in 1852 when my Black people were slaves. He grew up in a fancy home where his parents' status made them think they could look down on other whites, while my Black father feared Klan violence from all classes of white people. And yet the kind of opportunity privilege my white people had did not flow to me through my white mother. She gave it all up for the love of a Black man. Next slide, please. What we can learn from reading Say I'm Dead is how US attitudes on race mixing have evolved over the last 100 years. From the time that my great-grandmother was being raped in the 1880s through to today, we have seen the negative attitudes towards race mixing flipped on its head. This data comes from Pew Census and Gallup poll data. In 1958, as I told you earlier, 96% of Americans were against race mixing. In 1967, the Supreme Court overturned the final 16 states that had anti-miscegenation laws, and yet 73% of the country still disapproved. In the early 80s, the disapproval rate had gone down to 50%. And lo and behold, the census reports 1 in 10 marriages are mixed. That means all races marrying all races, not just Black and white. In 2015, we find an accelerated pace where 1 in 5 marriages are mixed. And for the first time, it was 2013 when mixed race families began to appear in movies, in television shows, and in commercials. 2013 was the year that Cheerios had the first airing of an image of an interracial family, and what a backlash they got. People demanded that that be taken down, that it was an abomination, and they didn't want to look at it. But the Cheerios company kept it up, and now we have all kinds of normalized representation of mixed race in America, but that's only been going on for 7 years. Just this week, the Pew Research Center issued a new report showing that in 2019, Gen Xs, who are 22 years and younger, 41% of them feel that intermarriage is good for society. And the preponderance of people who are first-time marriages in interracial unions and having families are millennials and Generation X. The census report predicts the future of a sharp incline in the growth of race mixing in this country, such that in 2050, they suggest that 20% of the United States population will be mixed race. And so this is a story that has a lot of angst around race in it, but also has a slice of the racial story that is positive as we lean further into Brown. Thank you very much. Kathy, back to you for Q&A.
Great, thank you all. So I know that Lauren had sent a note out in the chat. We're asking if folks have questions to put them in the Q&A. I have a few that have come in so far. So want to pose those, and then feel free to post others, and we'll make sure that we get them out to Dolores to answer. So one of the questions that was asked through the group was about kind of given your experiences in life and so many racist incidents in your life, why did you want to find out about your missing white family when people didn't even know that you existed? What was the drive behind that?
I think everybody wants to know where they're from and who they are. And I was no different. I wanted to know who the people were in my family. And I think it was so much more dramatic than just not knowing, but to understand my own identity. One thing that gives people agency in life is defining themselves, not letting other people tell you who you are, what you're capable of, where you can go. And I wanted to name myself, but I wanted to name all of me. I wanted to find out who I was and represent myself accordingly.
Good for you. Good for you. Well put, and sound advice. Couple other questions that have come in. You and I'm trying to paraphrase it, so forgive me. That you talked about in the book and referenced in your talk tonight that your mother didn't know anything about the consequences of intermarriage. that there was a reference that she, quoted something about Negro business wasn't their business. And can you speak to, how does that relate today in white people in today's racial reckoning who now want to understand the Black experience?
That conversation represented thinking in 1942. But when I listened to the white allies that joined the George Floyd riots in the street last year, what were they saying? I didn't know the police treated Black people like this. I didn't know what racism was and how it infested people's lives on a daily basis. It was the same conversation in 2020 that it was in 1942. Why is that? Because, in my opinion, a lot of it has to do with the separation of Blacks and whites. We have de facto segregation in this country. We don't have legitimized segregation as it used to be generations ago, but we live in different neighborhoods. Our kids go to different schools. There's no sleepovers between kids of different races. There's no Saturday project team going across town to another neighborhood. 74% of white Americans say they don't have a Black friend. If you don't know somebody, how can you possibly understand their life? If you don't understand their life, how can you fight for social justice? You don't even know what the problems may be. That's the racial reckoning that white people need to do. Find out the truth of what's going on and take an active role in addressing it.
Good for you. Thank you. I know Lauren is pulling a few more questions. Peter, you wanted to just provide some of the feedback that we're getting in some of the chats.
Yeah, thanks. Hi all, Peter Struzero, director at the library. Dolores, because of the setup of our Zoom as a webinar so that we can broadcast it and live stream it, we miss out on being able to see everyone's faces and see the way that they respond and react to some of the funnier things you say or things that might make them smile, but some of the comments are coming through in addition to questions. I just wanted to read a couple of those comments. One person said, I'm really loving the phrase, lean further into brown. Another person wrote, this book is just so beautifully written. And in the chat, someone wrote, not a question, just a comment. Although I read the book carefully and was moved by it, hearing you speak makes this so much more powerful. Your courage and the courage of your family members are so inspiring. There are lessons for all of us in your book and your discussion. Thanks. There's a bunch more questions coming through though.
Thank you for reading that. And I hope there's a chance to copy the chat so I could look at it after the event. I'd love to see every comment.
Okay, great.
Definitely. So one of the questions coming in is asking Dolores if you can talk more about your relationship with your older brother who lived on the white side of town. How did he fit in within your family? And how was his life different than your life?
My older brother was a bit different from David and I. He was a shy person and we were both fairly outgoing. He went to Catholic school and we went to public school. Catholic school kids were mostly white. And our neighborhood actually was subjected to a white flight. After we moved in, the neighborhood flipped to all Black and our school was Black. And so my older brother didn't quite fit in with the neighborhood crowd. He was always sort of an outsider. And because he looked so very white, when he was a little kid, some really dark kid in the neighborhood took a 2x4 with a rusted nail and slammed it into his head.
Oh my God.
Came running home with blood gushing out of his head and had to go to the emergency room for stitches. Later, when my father went down to talk to that boy's family, he said he did it because Charles looked so white. Wow. So, Charles made the statement, when I was writing this book, I interviewed everyone that you read about in the book. And I asked him, what can I say about you and how you lived your life? He said, Dolores, I had so much trouble because of the way I looked. And because we were raised as a Black family, yet people treated me as if I was a white person in the midst of Black people. I was not welcome. I just wanted to be left alone. I found a girl who wanted to get married. She was white, and we lived quietly by ourselves. But at Christmas time, my mom insisted we were all there together as a family for the holidays. And he was always still my brother. I mean, we still called on the phone, and the three of us kids remained close siblings. But I will say that he died in 2016, and I went to Buffalo to help his daughter arrange his funeral. The only Black people there were my daughter and I.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. So thank you. It's powerful to hear your answers and your experiences. A few more questions that are coming in. Were you scared to go public with your story? Have you ever had any backlash? The questioner, the person submitting that question, is noting how courageous you are and how much they enjoyed the book, but interested in about your experience in going public.
One thing about writing memoir is that you're telling people's secrets, and that's always risky business. I went, as I said before, I got on a plane and I went and found all those people that were in the Click Club and their children. I went to see each of my family members. I told them what I was trying to do, and I interviewed them. I had one of the Click Club kids, who was the closest to me, was against telling her mom's story. Her mom lived a double life. She had a white, very racist family in Ohio. Yet she had run away and married a Black man in Buffalo and had 3 dark children. And she never told the people in Ohio that she was married. And the people in Buffalo accepted the fact that she went home to her white family and basically disowned them. She would leave her kids for a long weekend with peanut butter sandwiches in the refrigerator and go to the baby shower or the 4th of July picnic. She said she couldn't give up either family. And when I wrote that in, I told them I was going to write that. And I was so worried. That was the most backlash that concerned me about what I wrote in that book. But when it came out, they all called me, all the brothers and the wives and the kids and everybody, clapping and said they were so glad I told the truth. As far as the public, I have not had much of a backlash. Whenever you speak about race, there are lots of different opinions, and people feel free, especially in a format like this one where you're not in the same space, to say all kinds of things. And a few of the times that I've made presentations, I have had naysayers in the audience who challenged me and criticized me. But I think as a Black person, I'm used to backlash. And I also am a person who always stands up. So it hasn't bothered me.
Good for you. There's a scene in the book, or there's a section in the book where you talk about the management dinner with your Southern colleagues, where there are some disparaging things said about Black people. You complain. The boss makes the person apologize. And they say, gee, I wouldn't have said that if I knew you were Black. Can you talk more about what you were thinking and feeling at that time? And other instances where people feel, because they feel that you're white, that it's okay for them to say disparaging things about Black people.
It's really interesting living on that line. where I cherish my Black heritage, and yet people take me for white and say things to me as if I were white. Because not only that management dinner, but many instances in my life that's happened. And what it's taught me is how prevalent casual racism is among white people.
Mhm.
That these kinds of things are said even to strangers without any expectation of a backlash or rebuke for that behavior. What I would like to say to this audience is, if you want to be an ally, you must speak up. You must help put a stop to that, even if it's Uncle Billy at Thanksgiving. It's time for people to hear and see themselves and what they're contributing to racism.
Exactly. Couple more questions. I just want to make sure that I have time to get them all in. So, one really neat thing is the alma mater that you share with the vice president, Howard University. How did your experience at the Black Mecca shape your identity and perspective on race?
I talked a little bit earlier about my time at Howard, and I would say that coming there as a naive student on scholarship, I didn't know what to expect, but what I found was a family. I found teachers who really cared about us, who would correct our mistakes, our misunderstandings, and the school even had classes, mandatory classes, for instance, swimming, because Black people don't swim. One reason has to do with their hair. Black people's hair is not straight, but you notice that many people wear straight hair. That's because they spend a fortune at the beauty shop getting the kinks out. One drop of water will revert it back to kink. And so, as a life-saving skill, we all had to learn to swim. Also, they had etiquette classes. They had public speaking classes. All these were mandatory because they said, we have a lot of bourgeois families here. There were a lot of children of actors and musicians, jazz musicians and professors and so forth. But there was also a large group like me who didn't know what they were doing. And we were called the diamonds in the rough. They were going to make sure that when we left there, we would fit the standard of a Howard graduate who could handle themselves in all situations and was fully prepared for every job. And as I mentioned earlier, they pounded into our heads. In economics, I was an economics major. We had to study third world economies and macroeconomics on how to improve the economic future of the continent of Africa. That was the kind of Afrocentric training we got, so that none of us could walk out of there with our heads down or afraid to go into all white situations or to not advocate for uplifting the race.
Yeah.
That's something that Catholic kids get when they go to Catholic colleges. That's something that women get when they go to women's colleges. That's what Mormons get when they go to Brigham Young. Black people get it when they go to Black colleges.
Interesting. Peter, I know you wanted to share a couple more comments that we're getting from folks.
Okay, thanks. We have a lot of our library staff tuned in, and some of our library staff's parents tuned in, and we're very happy to see them too. I'm just going to ask a couple. There's a couple of comments and questions. One from one of our staff members. You refer to your father and his coping with having to keep his mouth shut at work and being paid less. This staff member of ours was wondering, how did your mom cope with any feelings of isolation or sadness, having to keep it all together during that time?
It's a funny thing. My parents didn't raise racial issues in our house unless people brought them to us. So of course, my dad was very upset a lot of the time about how he was treated at work. This racist conversation that went on. He used to say that the owners of this ornamental steel welding business were people who came to Europe, came from Germany and Poland after the war. And my father said that the first word they learned when they got here was the N word, because they used it to his face all the time. He was the only Black person there at that job, never given his title, never given his right pay. My mom was the common sense person in the house. She would say that racism was foolishness in all its varieties. She didn't see why people behaved as they did. But in our house, we were sticking together. They never told us their story about having run away to get married. My little plain-spoken mom in her apron, who went off to work the night shift as a nurse's aide, was an FBI runaway, and we never knew it. I couldn't believe it when I found out. They just kept it all to themselves. And many of my Jewish friends have likened it to the seniors in their family who never talked about the Holocaust.
Mhm.
The barrage of trauma is something they carry inside and don't want to burden the younger generations with by telling and harping on it and reliving it all the time.
Couple more comments and questions. I've been told we've got until they've extended our programming on the live stream on the cable access channel a little longer. So a couple more comments, and then maybe Kathy, you can pick maybe 3 more questions. But a comment, one person wrote in the chat that their Nana passed as white for a long time until she was a teenager. And your story very much sounds like the story of her grandmother. They were forced to leave their home and move to another location as well. She added that they knew that their Nana's dad was Jewish, but until just 3 or 4 years ago now, they never knew who he was until they did their own search for information too. So you got some attendees tonight that are feeling your story from their own experiences.
That has happened in a number of my presentations where
Of course,
people
yeah.
have told me their stories, and it just shows how widespread this kind of trauma is in our society.
Another person asked, they said, what concrete recommendations do you have for me living in a very white world to help have less, to help add less to any sort of racism in our society? Then they clarified, what can they do? They're looking for concrete measures to take.
Okay, so I think, again, that we need to get to know each other much better, and we need to trust each other more. And so I would say, when you have home projects, please hire Black workers in the trades. There's a newspaper called the Bay State Banner, which is the Black newspaper of Greater Boston. And then there are listed all the roofers and movers and electricians and what have you. Hire them. Hire them to redo your kitchen. Find a Black accountant to do your taxes. Get connected to a public library or a public school in Mattapan, Dorchester, or Roxbury and tutor Black students. Find a Black student who is trying to get to college and help them pay their tuition. Put your money in a Black bank. One United Bank in Roxbury is the biggest Black-owned bank in the United States. Put your money there. Help them recycle it into community loans. Sign petitions, back candidates who are working for social justice. Go to Dudley Square in Roxbury and have lunch when the coronavirus allows. There's some very nice people down there and some good restaurants. There are a million things that you could do to reach out. Fund a fresh air kid from the Black community to go to summer camp. just put your thinking cap on, and I think you'll have a longer list.
Okay, great. Someone just sent us a link to the Bay State banner. I'm going to put it into the chat for everyone. Thank you, Catherine.
Great.
And Kathy, if we have time for maybe 2 more questions or 3 more questions.
Yeah. And great. People have been great. Appreciate. I wish we were together and having more fluid, but appreciate the interest and the questions that keep coming in. So one of the questions was, growing up, did you ever wonder about your mom's family and why you didn't see them and didn't have a connection with them?
I didn't. I think that the family, the found family in the Click Club and my dad's people in Buffalo were enough. And it just, I mean, we knew that we were oddballs. We knew that people didn't like the fact that my mom was living in the Black neighborhood. It just didn't occur to us. It just didn't occur to us. Although I do remember one incident where my grandmother lived down the block from us, and there was this ice cream shop a few blocks away. My mother loved all their fresh dipped ice cream. And so after dinner one night, we were walking down there, and my brother David was walking ahead of us. He and Charles were talking about all the flavors and what they were going to pick. And my father, I was walking between my father and mother, and my father says to my mother, "Look at old man Henry Lewis," talking about the way that David walked. And I said, "Well, who's old man Henry Lewis?" And my father said, "That's your grandfather." And my mom says, "Now you run along and go get grandma. Hurry up so she'll be ready." Cut the conversation off. It wasn't until, nothing else was ever said about him. It wasn't until we found out my mom's secret that I realized David's middle name was Lewis. It was my mom's last name, David Lewis Jackson.
Yeah, interesting. One of the questions is a little bit in a different direction, but is complimenting you on the book and how well it's written, and any advice or suggestions you have for somebody who wants to, become an author or hone their craft. You're writing a second book.
Yes, I am. I will say that when I decided to write this story, I knew nothing about creative writing. It's an art form unto itself. And I don't think that many people can just sit down and write a book without any training. It's a profession. I ended up going back to school in my 60s for a year's program on creative writing before I wrote this book. And I would also say that if a person is looking to write a memoir, they have to be really honest with themselves about the family secrets that are going to come out. Once you write it on the page, it's out there forever. Mm-hmm. And you want to be sure about the relationships that are going to be affected by what you write, and whether you really want to write all of those things. When you are writing about your own life, there's a lot of crying over the keyboard, because you begin to channel those moments, those words that somebody said to you, and relive them. And I'm going to say that writing memoir is not for the weak.
Yeah. Forces you to come to terms with a lot of things, or revisit them as an adult.
Kathy. That's right.
Right. All right, 2 more if we have time. So, someone's asking about, have you read Negroland by Margot Jefferson? Does the idea of the talented 10th resonate with you, or do you see that idea as problematic?
I did read Negroland, and I don't know Margot Jefferson, but I met a lot of Margot Jeffersons at Howard. People who came from those very privileged Black communities. I think that there's room in the tent for every Black person. no matter if they're homeless or they are hoping for a stimulus check or they're Margot Jefferson. I'm a respecter of all persons, and I think that what each person wants is the recognition of their humanity. Every person wants the recognition of their humanity. So in any group, you will have the higher class and the lower class and everything in between. I personally don't have a problem with any of them.
Thank you. Thank you for that. You in the book, you talk about the boogeyman. So who is the boogeyman?
The boogeyman sits right here. Sits right here on every Black person's shoulder. And he talks to you all day long. Be really careful about these white people. You're going to go into that job interview and you're going to do your best, but they're not going to give you a fair chance. It's time for the raises. They're going to shortchange you. You're going to apply for that apartment. They're going to tell you there's no vacancy. That person you work with is smiling at you, but they don't like Black people. You can tell by some of the things that they say and do. The history of racism is so deeply embedded in the psyche of Black Americans. There is no escaping the boogeyman. The way I came to recognize him when he had been with me from the age of 4, when I fell against the pot-bellied stove that heated our rented flat, and no white cab would come to take me to the hospital. That boogeyman had been there ever since, until we were reunited with our white branch of the family, who proved that love can overcome race. And I had to tame that boogeyman. I didn't put him out the door, because I still have to be careful of the police, for one.
We're one last question, and then want to give you an opportunity to do a closing. And I think Peter would like to, say some closing comments as well. So one of the questions we've gotten from a number of people, what's your next book about?
Slavery in colonial New England. The working title is Before Abolitionists.
Okay. And do we have a target for when that might be available?
No, we are in the drafting stage, and stay tuned. It will be a later date for sure.
Okay, great. So if you want to share any closing comments with us, Dolores, I'll just say thank you. I'll let Peter do a broader close, but it's been a pleasure, and I hope for you as well.
Yes, it has been. So thank you very much to the Board of Trustees, the Belmont Public Library, the Friends of the Library, and all of those wonderful community partners for having me tonight. I was really delighted to be invited, because I understand that the Belmont community and your partner libraries are people who are concerned about social justice. And I'm really happy to be able to share my story with such an audience. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Dolores. I want to thank you personally. Again, it's been a pleasure working with you in advance of this program. And I want to reiterate, we think you were the perfect author for this theme. You were the only author that we spoke with about this. So we were delighted that the first person we reached out to, we got such an enthusiastic yes from. And we've had a really great month of programming up to this point. I'd say we're in the 400 to 500 attendees region for the month worth of programs. And I want to thank you again. I want to thank our One Book, One Belmont committee again, with co-chair Lauren Fender, who's with us tonight. And I wouldn't be doing a good job as library director if I didn't give a shameless plug for what's coming up next. We do want to spread word about the second month of our community read, Better Through Books, Healing Community Together. Our second month, still focused on healing, is set to begin this Thursday, April 1st, with the beginning of a two-part series focused on wellness and resiliency with an area expert and foundress of the Wellness Consortium in nearby Arlington named Catherine Martin. In April, we'll have other local authors, Claire Willis and Marnie Crawford Samuelson, talk about their book, Opening to Grief, a series of outdoor, in-person nature walks, socially distanced with masks and smiles under the masks. We'll also have a panel discussion by our own Belmont Wellness Coalition. And later in the month of April, New York Times bestselling author Gabrielle Zevin with her book, The Storied Life of A.J. Fickery, as well as other regular library programming focused on wellness, coping, resiliency, and the overarching theme, which is healing. So this is not the end. We're just halfway through, but we're so pleased to have had Dolores with us tonight. And we thank you all for your attendance.
Thank you. Nicely done.
you.
Thank you, everybody.